Liang Ji stood in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at the reflection of his right arm. The bruise from the minor fall earlier that week had faded into an ugly shade of purple and yellow, a constant reminder of the incident. It was a small thing, really, a simple accident on his way home from work, but the discomfort lingered. His hand, a pale hand, with long fingers and soft skin, hovered over the injury, a wave of calm passing through him. There it was again, the familiar pull of his power. He could feel it inside him, a warm energy that spiraled up from his gut and into his chest, spreading into his hands. It was the kind of power you couldn't ignore, no matter how many times you tried. The thought of simply letting the bruise heal on its own, of allowing time to do its work, was inconceivable to him. He had healed worse wounds, broken bones, deep cuts, even a stab wound once, and with the same ease. It came naturally now. A sudden, sharp pain shot through his wrist as he gently placed his hand over the bruise. He winced. The pulse in his chest quickened. The power was rushing to the surface, ready to do what it always did, heal. But what would be the cost this time? Without thinking, Ji pressed harder. The bruise started to fade, the skin knitting together like a thread pulling itself taut. He felt a rush of relief. He could feel the healing, the soothing energy flowing through him, but then came the familiar aftertaste. A strange, unsettling sensation that came with the price of his ability. Something was always taken when he used it. The balance was never quite right. As the last remnants of the bruise vanished, Ji's heart skipped a beat. The energy coursing through him had rippled outwards, like a stone thrown into a pond, sending invisible waves to the edges of his being. The room felt warmer, the air thicker. He could sense it before he saw it, the slight shift in the energy around him. The apartment next door. Ms. Jiang, the elderly woman who lived in the unit adjacent to his, was sitting in her rocking chair, her frail figure slumped forward. He'd seen her earlier in the hallway, but she was always there, a fixture of the building. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. He knew what would happen next. Ms. Jiang was dying. He ran out of the bathroom without a second thought, pulling his shirt over his head as he rushed down the narrow hallway of the building. His heart raced as he reached her door. The energy from his healing had already spread, had already taken something from her, something he couldn't yet quantify. He banged on the door, shouting her name, Ms. Jiang. His voice broke as he pounded again. There was no answer. The sound of her breathing, faint and uneven, echoed from the other side. With trembling hands, Ji fumbled with the door handle and pushed it open. The room was dim, the only light coming from a single lamp beside her chair. She was slumped forward, her once thin body now a frail husk. Her face, pale and drawn, had aged years in the span of moments. Her hair, silvered from time, was now streaked with white in an almost unnerving way, as though time had consumed her in a flash. Ms. Jiang. Ji rushed to her side, kneeling down, but it was too late. Her eyes were already clouded, her breath shallow. Liang, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't understand. Ji felt his chest tighten as he cradled her head in his lap. The weight of her life slipping away felt unbearable. His hands shook, and for a moment, he considered healing her, just a little, to ease her suffering. But it was pointless. Every time he healed, someone else had to pay. I'm so sorry, Ji whispered to her, his voice trembling. I didn't mean for this to happen. But she didn't hear him. Ms. Jiang's eyes fluttered one last time, and then the life drained from her. Her body, once warm with the pulse of life, grew cold in his hands. Ji didn't know how long he sat there, holding her, too stunned to do anything else. The world outside her door continued on, oblivious. The sounds of the city filtered in through the window, distant traffic, the hum of streetlights. But for Ji, time had stopped. The apartment felt heavy, oppressive. He couldn't breathe. He'd caused her death. Not directly, but through his gift, his curse. Ji stood up slowly, trembling. There was a dull ache in his chest, a gnawing sense of guilt. He needed to get out of there. The walls felt too close. The power inside him had taken someone else. It always took someone else. With a final glance at Ms. Zhang's still body, Ji stumbled out of the apartment, his heart thumping in his chest. He had to leave. The streets outside were bustling with life, but Ji felt detached, as if he were walking through a fog. His footsteps were heavy, his mind swirling with thoughts. Had he just killed someone? He couldn't be sure. Could the power he wielded really be responsible for her death? The bruises he healed, the small cuts, those never had consequences this severe. But the pattern was there. It always happened. Each time he healed, someone paid the price that he'd tried to ignore it. He'd hoped that maybe, just maybe, he could control it. But that was a lie. The truth was impossible to deny anymore. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him from his thoughts. It was a message from his colleague, Dr. Xiaoling Liang. Can you meet me after work? I need to talk. Ji read it and felt a coldness spread through him. Ling was the only one who knew there was something off about him, though she had no idea what it was. She'd never asked directly, but her eyes always seemed to hold the question, like she was waiting for him to confess. To tell her what was wrong. But he didn't know if he could face her right now. He didn't know if he could face anyone. It had been a few weeks since she had last seen Ling. He couldn't even remember the last time they'd had a conversation that wasn't strained. He'd been avoiding her, dodging every invitation and every text. But today, he couldn't avoid her any longer. Ling's office was in a small research lab on the outskirts of the city, tucked away in an old building that was starting to show its age. Ji stood outside, looking up at the old brick structure, hesitating. He had been here countless times before, but today felt different. He could almost feel her gaze on him, like she already knew why he was there. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door. Inside, the sterile scent of antiseptic hit him first. It was too quiet. Ling was at her desk, typing something into her computer. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and there were dark circles under her eyes, as though she hadn't been sleeping well. Ji, she said, not looking up from the screen. I'm glad you came. He didn't answer right away. His eyes darted to the papers scattered across her desk. He could see the telltale signs of research, medical notes, test results, and half-empty coffee cups. But there was something else, too. Something that made his stomach turn. She finally looked up, and her eyes widened slightly when she saw the exhaustion on his face. You're not well, she said softly, concern in her voice. Ji shook his head. I'm fine. She didn't believe him. Ling knew him too well. She leaned forward, folding her arms. You don't look fine. Ji, you've been avoiding me. You've been different. What's going on? Ji swallowed hard. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. How could he tell her the truth? How could he explain the thing he had been running from all these years? Ji swallowed hard, the familiar tightness in his throat making it difficult to speak. He had been here before, facing her, with the same question in his mind, the same struggle to find the right words. He had spent countless nights wondering how he could explain himself, how he could tell her the truth without her thinking he was insane. But now, as she sat across from him, her gaze unwavering, she realized that he couldn't keep hiding anymore. He couldn't pretend that everything was fine. Not when everything inside him was falling apart. Not when the death of Ms. Jiang, of so many others, was weighing so heavily on him. Ji began, his voice faltering. I'm not fine, Ling. I haven't been fine for a long time. She leaned in, her expression softening. What's going on? You don't have to keep this to yourself. You can talk to me. Ji's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the chair. His breath was shallow. He had always been so careful around Ling, hiding the truth of who he was, afraid that if she knew, she would run. But now, he couldn't keep it in any longer. There's something I need to tell you, Ji said, his voice barely a whisper. It's something I've been hiding for years. Ling raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but still unsure of what he was about to say. She gestured for him to continue, her voice gentle. What is it? Ji closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. I have a gift. I can heal people. I can heal myself, others, anything. But there's a catch. Ling's brow furrowed. A catch? Whenever I heal, I take something from those around me. Their life force. It's like a transfer, Ji explained, his voice shaking. When I heal, people around me, sometimes people I don't even know, suffer. They age rapidly, lose vitality, and, sometimes they die. Ling's mouth parted, and for a moment, she looked at him in silence, disbelief and confusion clouding her expression. She couldn't have understood. No one could. This kind of thing wasn't supposed to be real. It was too impossible. Too cruel. I didn't mean for it to happen, Ji continued, his eyes pleading for her to understand. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. But every time I heal, there's a price. It's always someone else who pays. Someone who's close to me, or someone I've never even met. And I can't stop it. The room seemed to close in on him as the words left his mouth. Ji wanted to look away, but he couldn't. He had told her. Now it was out there, hanging between them like an invisible thread that tied them together in a way he had never allowed before. Ling was silent for a long time. Ji couldn't bring himself to look at her. He was afraid of what he might see in her eyes. Fear? Anger? Disgust? He had seen it before, in the eyes of the people he had helped, in the people whose lives he had destroyed without meaning to, but then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Ji, this is insane. He nodded, his face pale. I know. But you can't just. Ling stopped herself, shaking her head. You can't be serious. You can't have this power and not expect there to be consequences. Ji's heart clenched. It was the one thing he had feared more than anything, being told what he already knew. That his power was unnatural. That it was a curse, not a blessing. I didn't ask for it, he said softly, his voice raw. It's not something I wanted. But it's there, and every time I use it, someone else pays. I can't change that. I don't know how to make it stop. Ling stood up, pacing across the room. Have you tried to figure out how to control it? There has to be some way to reverse it, some way to stop people from dying. I've tried. I've tried everything, Ji said, his voice breaking. I've spent years trying to control it, trying to understand it. But every time I heal, the price is the same. The life force I take from others, it doesn't just go away. It's like a balance that has to be maintained. Ling stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing as she turned to face him. You said the price is always someone else, right? But why? Why are they the ones who suffer? Ji shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. I don't know. I don't know why it happens. All I know is that it's not just the people I heal that are affected. Every time I heal, the people around me get pulled into it. It's like the power has a life of its own. It chooses who gets hurt. And I can't stop it. Ling's face softened, and for the first time since he had arrived, she reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. Ji, this is too much. I don't know how to help you, but I won't leave you alone in this. We'll figure it out. We have to. Ji shook his head, his voice choked. There's nothing to figure out, Ling. This is who I am. This is my curse. And I can't live with it anymore. Ling didn't say anything for a moment. She stood there, silent, as if she were weighing his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady and sure. There has to be something. You can't just give up. Ji turned away from her, unable to look her in the eye. You don't understand. Every time I heal, someone dies. I've seen it happen. I've felt it happen. People age before my eyes, their bodies wither away, and he broke off, choking on the words. I can't keep doing this. Ling stepped closer to him, placing both hands on his shoulders. Ji, listen to me. You can't just shut yourself off from everyone. You can't keep pushing people away. I'm not going to let you do this alone. Ji looked up at her, his eyes raw with emotion. But I don't want anyone else to die because of me. I can't bear it. I know you don't, Ling said softly, her voice full of understanding. But we need to find a way to control it. We need to figure out what's causing this. You're not a monster, Ji. This power doesn't define who you are. He took a shaky breath, his mind racing. Was it possible? Could they really find a way to control his powers? Could they reverse the damage he had caused, undo the pain and loss he had inflicted? I don't know if there's a way to fix it, Ji whispered, but I can't keep living like this. Ling stood silently beside him, her hand still on his shoulder. They were two people, connected by something far greater than either of them understood. And for the first time in years, Ji felt a flicker of hope deep within him. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to fix what had been broken. The next few days blurred together for Ji. He found himself caught in a whirlwind of emotions, fear, guilt, hope, and a strange sense of relief. For the first time in ages, he wasn't alone in his struggle. Ling had insisted they find answers together, even though Ji didn't know if there were any answers to be found. He wasn't sure there was a way to fix what had been broken inside him, but Ling wasn't giving up. And for the first time, neither was he. They scoured research papers, medical texts, and old folklore, hoping to find something that could explain what was happening to him. Ji had never told anyone the full truth about his power, and now, as he pored over page after page, he began to wonder if there was more to his gift, or curse, than he had ever imagined. Ling's determination never wavered. She spent hours combing through old records, searching for any mention of healers or powers similar to Ji's. They visited libraries, met with researchers, and even spoke to people who claimed to have knowledge of the supernatural. But the answers they were looking for were elusive, and with each passing day, Ji's sense of dread deepened. The more he searched for a solution, the more he feared that there was no escape from his fate. As the days passed, Ji found himself torn between a fragile sense of hope and the relentless pull of his dread. Ling's persistence was both a comfort and a reminder of the guilt that gnawed at him every time he used his power. Despite her encouragement, he couldn't shake the feeling that every time he healed, he had committed a sin, something that could never be erased, something that had already cost too much. Ling had grown even more determined, often spending long nights searching through research that seemed to lead them in circles. The more they uncovered, the more Ji felt the weight of his curse pressing down on him. He began to fear that there was no answer, no remedy for what he had become. The world around him continued on as it always had, but he was trapped in a cycle of guilt and shame. It was late one evening when Ling found something unusual. They were in her office again, surrounded by papers and books. Ji sat at the desk, his eyes tired from the hours of reading. Ling stood near the window, holding an old manuscript she had found in a forgotten corner of a library's archive. She had been sifting through texts about ancient healers, obscure rituals, and mystical powers. The pages of the manuscript were yellowed with age, the writing faint but legible enough to make out. Ji, I think you should see this, Ling said, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and excitement. Ji rubbed his eyes, too weary to care. He had already read through so many stories of magic and healing that his mind felt numb. What is it? Ling turned, holding up the manuscript. It's about a healer, someone who had powers similar to yours. But this healer, they found a way to control the price of their gift. They learned to balance it, to share the burden. Ji leaned forward, his attention piqued despite himself. He hadn't considered that there might be a way to control it. He had always assumed that this power had been something he simply had to live with, like a curse that couldn't be escaped. Ling began reading aloud from the manuscript, translating as best as she could from the ancient text. The healer, known only as the Gifted One, was said to have possessed the same ability, to heal, to take away the pain of others, but at a cost. The text speaks of an ancient ritual, a ritual to bind the healer's power to their own soul, to balance the exchange of energy so that no one else would suffer. It says that by doing this, the healer could control the transfer of life force, directing it with precision. Ji's heart skipped a beat. So, it's possible? There's a way to control it? Ling nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the pages. It looks like it. But the ritual is dangerous. It's not something you can just perform without understanding its consequences. It could be the answer you've been looking for, or it could make things worse. Ji stood up, his hands shaking slightly. I'll do whatever it takes. I can't keep living like this. If there's a way to stop this from hurting others. Ling met his gaze, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. I'll help you, but we need to understand this ritual completely. We need to be sure it's the right path. They spent the next few days poring over the manuscript, trying to decipher the ancient language and rituals described within. It became clear that the process was complex, too complex, perhaps. It wasn't just a matter of performing a series of steps. The ritual required more than that. It required understanding the very nature of the healer's power, a deep connection to the energy they wielded, and a willingness to risk everything in order to bind it to one's soul. Ji's nights became filled with restless thoughts, his mind racing with the possibilities and dangers of the ritual. He couldn't help but wonder if he was truly ready for the sacrifice it might demand. But what choice did he have? He couldn't continue this way. He couldn't let anyone else die because of him. Finally, after days of preparation, they were ready. Ling had gathered everything they needed: herbs, crystals, ancient symbols etched onto parchment, and an altar they had constructed from the scattered remnants of old texts. Ji stood before it, his heart pounding in his chest. Are you sure about this? Ling asked, her voice soft, but filled with a quiet fear. Ji nodded, swallowing his nerves. I have no other choice. Ling stepped back, giving him space. Then let's begin. He closed his eyes, focusing on the power within him, the energy that hummed beneath his skin. He had always felt it there, but now it seemed louder, more insistent. This time, it was different. This time, he was going to try to control it. He felt the pull of the energy deep inside him, as though it were stretching, reaching out, trying to break free. Ji's hands began to glow with a faint, golden light. The symbols on the altar seemed to pulse with life as he chanted the words from the manuscript, his voice steadied despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He focused on the ritual, on the delicate balance he had to achieve. He needed to bind the power to his soul, to make it his own, so that it wouldn't take from others anymore. For a moment, nothing happened. The air was thick with tension, the room heavy with silence. Ji's heart raced faster, and his hands began to tremble. The energy inside him was alive, fighting to break free, but he held firm, repeating the words over and over, willing himself to control it. Then, suddenly, there was a sharp, electric jolt. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, and a flash of light burst from his hands. Ji cried out, falling to his knees as the energy surged through him, overwhelming him. It was as though his very soul were being stretched and torn apart, the power coursing through every fiber of his being. The pain was unbearable, and for a moment, he thought he might not survive it, but then, just as quickly as it had come, the pain stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence, and Ji collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. His body felt heavier than it had before, like a weight had been added to his very bones. But something was different now. The energy inside him was calm, still, no longer fighting for release. It was contained. Bound. He opened his eyes, his vision blurry, but his mind clearer than it had been in years. The power was still there, but it was his. He had done it. Ling rushed to his side, her face pale with worry. Ji? Are you okay? Ji nodded weakly, though he still felt the lingering effects of the ritual. I think it worked. She helped him to his feet, her hands gentle on his shoulders. You're sure? Ji took a deep breath, testing the air around him. The energy still pulsed within him, but it felt different now. It was no longer a chaotic force, something he couldn't control. It was steady, like a river flowing within him, but he could feel every movement, every current. He had bound it to himself, and in doing so, he had taken away its power to hurt anyone else. I think it worked, he said again, his voice stronger this time. Ling looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and relief. Then you're free. Free from the cost. Free from the curse. Ji stood in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of the ritual settle within him. He could feel the energy still there, but now it was his to command. It was no longer a curse. It was a gift, but as he stood there, a thought began to form at the back of his mind. A lingering question, one that had been gnawing at him ever since he had first discovered his powers. Was he truly free? Or had he simply exchanged one kind of burden for another? The answer wasn't clear yet, but one thing was certain: he had taken the first step toward redemption. And that was enough for now.